Hello, everyone. Welcome in. We're going to allow just a few moments for everyone to join us today. Thank you so much for being with us, and welcome to our next program in this Taking Action Together series. Once again, I'm going to give just a few moments for everyone to join us. All right, so we have a couple folks trickling in. I'm going to go ahead and kick things off. So some of you may recognize me. My name is Hannah Siegel. I am the social media and marketing coordinator here at the AHEC. I first have to start off by giving a huge shout out to both Larry and Cinda Goldberg, Jeffrey and Gail Bayer, and Ronnie and Donald Hess for their incredible sponsorship of this program. We have many partners who have helped us spread the word, who are all listed on our website. So I encourage you to check them out and help us pay them due thanks. We also have a wonderful team working for us behind the scenes that I would love to give a huge shout out to. That includes our wonderful executive director, Lisa Bachman, our director of education, Amy, and our administrative assistant, Caleb, who is in fact very integral to this webinar today. So thank you to them. Before we get started, we have a few small housekeeping items. So first of all, we will be leaving time at the end of today's presentation for Q&A. So if you have any questions for our wonderful speakers today, please submit them by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll be working behind the scenes throughout the webinar to take inventory of those questions and make sure that they are answered. We'll give you a few reminders that that's going on, just in case you forget. Second, we are very happy to provide these events to you free of charge. So if you do enjoy today's program, we would greatly appreciate a donation of any size. Your gift will enable us to continue providing this important content, and we will be putting a link in the chat, allowing you to find where to do that. So without any further ado, I am so pleased to introduce you to both Professors Jonathan Wiesen and Jordan Kiper. Dr. Wiesen is a professor of history at UAB Birmingham and the chair of the history department. He received his PhD at Brown University with a storied career researching state violence and Nazi-era oppression. He is the author of West German Industry and the Challenge of the Nazi Past, Creating the Nazi Marketplace, Commerce and Consumption in the Third Reich, and Nazi Germany, Society, Politics, and Culture, amongst many other scholarly articles and pieces of work. Most recently, Wiesen won the 2020 Hans Rosenberg Article Prize for American Lynching in the Nazi Imagination, Race and Extralegal Violence in the 1930s Germany. He is currently writing a book on US anti-Black racism in the German imagination. Meanwhile, Professor Kiper is an assistant professor of anthropology at UAB Birmingham and a faculty associate at the Institute for Human Rights. His research is highly interdisciplinary, drawing from anthropology, cognitive science, human rights, and philosophy to examine the social conditions of intergroup conflict. This means taking a close look at dangerous speech, authoritarianism, and religious systems. To supplement his work, he has conducted ethnographic fieldwork in states like Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, and Serbia. He has also collaborated with legal scholars to pin down the effects of digital authoritarianism on human rights activists. Our goal in holding these programs is to provide you all with at least one thing you can take away and put into action. With such brilliant academics on screen, I'm confident you will find at least one thing that you can take away and put into action. So please join me in welcoming Jonathan and Jordan.
Thank you so much. I'm going to start and then pass it over to Dr. Kiper. So thanks so much, Hannah. Thanks so much to the AHEC, an organization that's very close to my heart. I really appreciate this series. And I think this particular theme is very timely now as we watch the news and try to figure out how people are understanding conflict in the Middle East, what they're yelling, what they're protesting. And so we have a lot of cross currents going on, lots of sloganeering. So I hope that Dr. Kiper and I can at least contribute to a broader understanding of how the longer history of propaganda and hate speech works, and then maybe how you might understand and apply it to things like the rise of anti-Semitism today or other kind of hateful action that you might see around the world, including in our own country, sadly. So I'll be focusing on Nazi Germany. Dr. Kiper will be focusing on the former Yugoslavia. Both of these are sites of genocide in the 20th century. And the broader point we want to make, which is consistent with what the AHEC has said over and over again in its mission, is that hate speech and hateful imagery can lead to genocide. Now, I want to make a couple points by looking at Nazi Germany, and that's one, that hate speech doesn't just emerge from nothing and then circulate around society. It really does depend on the active work of propagandists who plant ideas that germinate and grow and draw in even well-intentioned people. So I'm going to show that. And then I want to argue that hatred can target one group, but that it can spread easily to other victims, something we know from the Nazi period, but that we have to be reminded of. So my focus on propaganda I've had that for a long time. And one of the things we think about with propaganda is the necessity of technology, modern technology, radio, movies, print imagery. But one of the points I want to make today in understanding Nazi anti-Semitism is that it is grounded in century-old myths, and these myths persist today. So the first thing I'll say about anti-Semitism is that it's built on conspiracy theories. Now, how do you define conspiracy theories? We all have our general understanding of them, but the term conspiracy theory, according to the scholar Jovan Byford, is that it describes explanations which presume that a historical or political event or collection of events occurred as a consequence of a carefully worked out plan, plotted in secret by a small group of powerful individuals. So this is a consistent trope of anti-Semitism. And it applies to other groups, though. Jews are, in some cases, this secret group. Other times it might be the Illuminati or communists or the US government. Notice Pizzagate, a modern version of the conspiracy theory. A modern conspiracy theory relies on this secretive group of people meeting somewhere. Now, it's built on a fundamental claim that some force is operating behind political life, and that economic developments or political developments are part of a sinister maneuvers on the part of a secretive, powerful, menacing cabal. So why this view? Why do people hold on to and buy into conspiracy theories? Well, the short answer is that it helps explain and give meaning to traumatic events, to wars, to political assassinations, to diseases, to financial crises. But what's interesting about conspiracy theories throughout history is that they're more than just a claim that the events in history are the outcome of collusion or evil plots. Rather, they are they have alluring stories. People are drawn in by common tropes that exist across the spectrum of myths and conspiracy theories. They often sound remarkably alike. So one of the things I hope to leave with you is an understanding of the story arc, the rhetorical ideas that repeat themselves over and over again, regardless of who the supposed evil force is. So let's focus first on, obviously, the one that we can laugh at. We have an idea that we can just brush it away, that, the idea presented at one point by politicians, this particular one from Georgia, that somehow the wildfires in California were started by the Rothschilds, the Jewish banking family's space lasers. This has promoted members of even the Rothschild family to write about the history of this anti-Rothschild, anti-Semitic myth. But I think the important thing I want to note is when we look at some of these images, they're not only to be laughed at and wished away. They're part of very serious traditions that have led to bloodshed. So what are some of these myths that persist and since the early modern years and medieval era? One of these is a familiar one to some who have studied anti-Semitism. Jews routinely poisoned the wells of Christians. The idea is that to explain sickness, to explain suffering, you have to have a perpetrator. And that, according to anti-Semitic literature going back 1,000 years, is due to the poisonous influence of Jews, always presented in some cases, almost always as in the right, from a 19th century French book, a group of people secretly hurting Christians. Jews were the cause of pestilence and pandemics. The Black Death, of course, the bubonic plague, which killed a quarter of the population of Europe in the 14th century. This was blamed on Jews. You need a perpetrator to explain things. And here is an image of Jews being punished, supposedly, for their misdeeds, burning to death. Another familiar one is that Jews desecrated the communion wafer for Catholics by piercing it with sharp instruments, so-called desecration of the host. So again, it's built on this idea of a secret gathering of Jews who want to harm Christianity in some way. And what's interesting about these myths is they don't have to be internally coherent or even make sense. For example, Jews who don't have the Eucharist or the wafer as part of their religious tradition would never think to pierce it. Or in the imagery, of course, the blood of Christ on the right there comes out. But why you would think that Jews would do that or even be interested in doing it if they don't believe in that is immaterial to the broader myth of Jewish conspiracy. Perhaps the most famous one, the so-called blood myth or blood libel, is that Jews drain the blood of young children, like Simon of Trent in England in the late medieval period, and use it in matzah. So again, these sound absurd, but they're with us today. They persist and they feed into other tropes and narratives about anti-Semitism. So we have these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that the Nazis, when they come to power in 1933, will build on. And while the Nazis themselves didn't concern themselves that much with religion, they're fundamentally interested in this idea that persists, that Jews are engaged in a worldwide conspiracy to destroy. And then you can put fill in the blanks. Is it to destroy Christianity? Is it to destroy Germany? You can remove Christianity and put in there whatever you want. So the structure of this myth has been around for over 1,000 years, really 2,000, this last one, if you look at the response to how Jews were persecuted after the killing of Jesus. So the Nazis, as I said earlier, set up an apparatus to spread these ideas. It is not the case that somehow you have these sort of right-wingers in Germany just believing whatever they believe. They work and orchestrate the spread of these violent ideas, and they update them. So here's just a look at some small sampling of Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry and what it perpetrated to sell the idea that Jews were the internal enemy and the global enemy. And all of these titles, you can't necessarily translate them easily, but Aryans and Jews over here, or the poison mushroom. You may have gone to an earlier event in this series where that children's book was mentioned, Jews as the source of poison and pestilence. Jews out, degenerate art. One of the most famous that is still believed today and still read is, of course, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was reprinted readily by the Nazi propaganda ministry in 1938 and earlier. Here's just a sort of sample of the idea drawn. This was a forgery the minute it came out in the early part of the 20th century in Russia. People knew it was a forgery, but yet that doesn't stop you from propagating the myth that Jews, in the quotes in the introduction here, Jews' bloodthirsty desire to murder and revenge peoples is constantly repeated in their novels throughout their history. And this is a genuine picture of this secret cabal. You can find this book in kiosks around the world, including in the Arab world. People take it very seriously because it fits into their understanding of politics, that somehow there's a group of string pullers behind the scenes. Or you have the familiar images that sadly are still with us today in American and global politics, the Jew as the capitalist, the fat cat, the hungry, the money-hungry, cigar-chomping, greedy string puller who also is both managing the finances of the world, but also stingy and greedy. And so what you find in these images is that they're sort of profligate, they're broad. They can take in whatever you want to put into them. Jews get blamed for everything that you can imagine. So in this case, you might have this image of the Jewish capitalist who's working behind the scenes, but it's also paired with a totally different and opposite image of the Jew as both poor and not having any money, and for that matter, communist or socialist. So Jews are once wandering, finding new homes around the world as they're kicked out of dominant Christian societies. On the other hand, they're controlling these societies. So this one is a piece of propaganda. On the left, the eternal Jew, an exhibit and movie in Nazi Germany. And then there's the pestilence of the world, the wandering, poor Eastern European shtetl Jew. So somehow these myths contain their opposites, they contain contradictions, but they spread wildly. Lest you think the Nazis in the 1930s and 40s can't make use of some of the older blood libels. You see in their magazine, The Stormer, one of the most anti-Semitic dailies in Nazi Germany, you see the references to the blood libel, in this case, on a cover image of a newspaper in 1938. This is actually from the West German Observer, not the Der Stürmer, the Stormer. But here is another indication of the updated view that somehow Jews are poisonous, they're corrupting, that they are contact with Jews will somehow taint you. And this has practice in real life too, as Jews are kicked out of swimming pools, beaches. It's not just the myths that pervade, but they are paired with real policy. So the Talmud forbids Jews to heal Gentiles, so the claim is here, notwithstanding the fact that there were many Jewish doctors until they were kicked out. But what's important is that even if these myths don't overtly remain in our society, and they certainly abide in many societies, we see versions of them that explain why Jews are sensitive, for a number of reasons, to repeated history. So this is an image my sister saw, and some of you may have seen it on stores right after October 7th, and then the Israeli incursion into Gaza. You see stickers all over the supermarkets, in this case, the Albertsons in Oakland, California, with boycott Israeli goods contaminated with apartheid and Zionism. So even if the person who stuck these labels on there was ignorant, didn't know the history of how Jews are portrayed as a contaminating force, they have resonance. They remind us of the time in 1933 when Jewish stores were blockaded, and stickers like the one on the right would say, "Germans, protect yourselves. Do not buy from Jews." The idea that Jewish products would contaminate you and hurt the German public. So we have to realize that even if you see a sort of what you might claim is a hypersensitivity in Jewish understandings of anti-Semitism, it's well earned. There are tropes that are with us in the lifetime of my parents and some of your lifetimes that trigger Jews to understanding the kind of fund of anti-Semitism that people are consciously or unconsciously drawn. I want to make a couple more points, and that's that you don't have to buy into this wild stereotyping. So this is the Stormer, daily articles about Jews as guilty, as sinful, as battling with the devil. But this well-dressed person walking by, perhaps even shaking his head at the Nazi propaganda in the 1930s, might yet still buy into versions of this, which Nazi society depended on to bring people along. So it's the less overt stereotyping that exists alongside this crude imagery that I would argue helped the Nazis proceed against this minority. So sort of an earlier version of Some of My Best Friends Are, and that was, in fact, a statement that's not at all born of hatred, but reflects an idea that Jews can mostly be bad, but not all of them are bad. You know, the sort of token Jew. This narrative plays into an idea somehow that, you know, there are some good ones out there, but most are not. Throughout the 1930s, you get people making concessions. The Nazis argued that there are too many Jews in health, medicine, law, the universities. So you might say, oh, I reject that kind of blood libel stuff, but let's concede that somehow there are too many X, Y, and Z. But notice that this language still gives a myth to the idea that somehow there should be a set number of people of Jewish background, ancestry, or religious faith that should be in different walks of life. Or even a myth that Jewish assimilated Jews themselves might ascribe to, that, I like the German Jews, but the poor ones, the shtetl Jews, are making things bad for us. So, I like half the group, but the other half is deserving of our hatred. These are the kind of tropes you might still see today. Or perhaps interestingly, the most revealing, which you hear from older Germans, I used to hear, and then you read in interviews. I never took the crude stuff seriously, but that's the problem. I think you have this sense that, you can brush it off, that Goebbels and other makers of propaganda can do their own thing and we can wish it away, but you have to take it seriously, both the subtle hints toward xenophobia and the more overt ones. Many of us know this phrase. I think this speech, it's come up before in earlier sessions. Certainly those of you who study the Holocaust know about Pastor Niemöller's sense of shame that he didn't speak up. And this is a key point, I think, not just that what was first a roundup of left-leaning individuals then led to Jews and then to Niemöller himself, who was arrested by Hitler. But I think the idea is important to emphasize that when you dehumanize, in this case, the Jews, it starts to have a ripple effect or a snowball effect. So alongside Jews, we have intellectually disabled people, so-called imbeciles, who were seen as lives unworthy of life. Or you see Roma, so-called gypsies, Sinti and Roma, who were gathered, studied, monitored, and sent to concentration camps and death camps. Or you have, of course, gay and trans Germans in Dachau. You have gay men, some gay women arrested, isolated, put in some cases, but put in the general prison population. In other cases, beaten, sent to Auschwitz, etc. So this is the idea that hatred is profligate, it spreads, it builds on itself. So even if the myth of Jewish power you don't think it affects you, it has the function of propagating itself. I want to end with one slide, and it leads to the question, how do you fight it? A theme unto itself. How do you fight the persistence of anti-Semitism? Germany and the United States have very different approaches. The German penal code has real consequences for showing the imagery such as I showed, except in an academic setting, or espousing it. So you could go to jail for diminishing the Holocaust. If you disseminate Nazi propaganda in a sort of non-educational way, swastikas, Mein Kampf, you could be punished wearing a Nazi uniform, supporting Hitler. These are all playing into rules about violating laws of celebrating the Third Reich, and you could face up to 3 years in prison even. So the United States tendency is to let speech run, let it run its course, let protesters in Skokie, Illinois, anti-Semites march, and that this is part of the public discussion that will presumably turn on and isolate these people. I'm not going to offer an approach, but it's something that we should think about, and I have my students think about a lot. How do you fight hate speech? How do you fight propaganda? Is it better to leave it in the public sphere, or is it better to punish it outright? On that kind of questioning note, I want to hand things over to my colleague at UAB, Dr. Jordan Kiper.
Okay. Hello, everyone. It's an honor to spend this hour with you, and thank you, Jonathan, for a great presentation. I'm going to build on Jonathan's talk by bridging Nazi propaganda to the Balkan Wars, and my foundational structure for doing so is going to be the development of speech crimes in international criminal law. So the plan for my talk is that I'll first highlight some key concepts from international speech crimes and connect these to the Balkan Wars, and then consider when hate propaganda is most likely to be especially dangerous. And to begin, let me provide some very rough definitions which can serve as guideposts for us. A good overarching term, I think, is coined by the legal scholar Susan Benish, who uses dangerous speech to describe expressions that include what I'm going to talk about. Dangerous speech is any form of expression, so it can be speech, text, or images that can increase the risk that its audience will condone or participate in violence against members of another group. This is a nice definition because it focuses our attention on an important part of the propaganda spectrum, and that is speech acts which are directed at inciting or instigating violence or persecution against the targeted civilian population. And that is a particular kind of violence. With dangerous speech, we're often talking about collective violence, which is aptly defined by the US Department of Justice as the instrumental use of physical or structural force intended to hurt, damage, or kill by people who identify themselves as members of a group, whether it's a group, the group is transitory or has a more permanent identity, against another group or set of individuals in order to achieve political, economic, or social objectives. So quintessential examples of collective violence include terrorism, state-perpetrated violence such as genocide, repression, and other human rights abuses, and organized crime such as gang warfare or banditry. And to differentiate these from just wars or state security made in self-defense, honoring jus ad bellum and jus in bello, human rights scholars use the term atrocity crime in place of collective violence. An atrocity crime includes war crimes, crime against humanity, and genocide, as more fully delineated on the slide here, ranging from indiscriminate killing and hostage taking to genocide. For brevity, I'm going to use the term violence in place of collective violence or atrocities going forward. Such violence is caused by several preceding chains of events, one of which is dangerous speech, which sets violence in motion or further propels it. And such speech is known as a speech crime. In international law, these are expressions that in certain contexts warrant accountability for the speaker. And here I'm going to focus on the most egregious speech crimes, namely incitement, instigation, and persecution, since their history connects Nazi propaganda to the Balkan Wars and contemporary issues. That said, the questions I want to consider are, first, when is an expression a possible speech crime? And in particular, in the context of transitional justice, when we can analyze extant data and ethnographic accounts, as in the former Yugoslavia, where I work as an anthropologist, an issue is how hate propaganda against others contributes to atrocities, as in Serb hate propaganda during the Yugoslav breakup towards Muslims. Second, regardless of the specific expressions that might incriminate a speaker post hoc, because during transitional justice, it's often one or two speech acts that are clear indications of violent intentions or are the most proximate to violence. So we should also ask, in what conditions are hate propaganda most dangerous? And to answer these, we need to go back to the end of World War II at the Nuremberg trials, where 24 prominent Nazis were indicted, one of those being Julius Streicher, the propagandist and editor of Der Stürmer. Now, questions confronting the prosecutors, who were cognizant of justifying and establishing legal precedent for their claims, was what made propaganda like Streicher's dangerous? Was that danger at the level of criminality, and how could they know? And how can we know in similar cases? To address these queries, the overall strategy of the prosecution was to link Streicher's propaganda to Nazi atrocity crimes and its extermination program. And this involved three lines of interconnecting evidence, which I'm summarizing and will inform the rest of my discussion. First, the prosecution showed that Streicher engaged in incessant dehumanization, or as the philosopher David Smith prefers to say, monster making. And that Streicher did in publication after publication of Der Stürmer, where Jews were portrayed as pests, diseases, and inherent criminals responsible for nearly every social evil. And these speech acts were accompanied by misinformation that was designed to answer for Nazi readers the question, why was there suffering and injustice in the world? With a simple answer, scapegoating an entire group of people as the source, and critically as an existential threat. The second line of evidence, building on the former, were speech acts made by Streicher against Nazi threats, from which he defended the necessity of radicalized security politics. And taking a step back here, security politics are carried out by any state security apparatus with the organizational norms and capacities typical of such institutions. But when atrocity crimes occur, all the features of security politics have become radicalized by extreme hardline ideological worldviews, which make a recognizable civilian population appear as justified targets of violence. And Stryker was shown to have, over the course of decades, been a hardline ideologue, normalizing the Nazi worldview of having no choice but to use indiscriminate force at every level of the state against threatening categories of people. And to illustrate, he often concluded discussions saying that Jews and eventually others, such as Slavs and homosexuals, threatened all of humanity. And indeed, hate propagandists like Stryker blame targeted groups for wide-ranging injustices, or what might be called social crimes, such as abstract wrongdoing, like racial pollution, which has gone unpunished, they claim, and thereby portray imminent violence against them as justified revenge. And from existential threats and calls for vengeance, hate propagandists push security politics towards eliminating those threats. For example, the Nuremberg prosecution centered on Stryker's all too common appeal to exercise revenge against Jews when he would say such things as revenge will break loose one day and it will exterminate Jewry from the face of the earth. In response to such evidence, Stryker claimed at his trial in his defense that when his propaganda spoke of extermination, he didn't mean it literally. And in reply, the prosecutors presented the third line of evidence. Now, Stryker often plagiarized other sources, including the Israelite weekly newspaper, which reported in detail injustices against Jews, which Stryker copied verbatim into Der Stormer, praising the violence. And the prosecution, anticipating that Stryker might say he didn't mean what he said or know what he was doing, presented related excerpts that followed his report, such as Stryker's own words that a punitive expedition will provide the same fate for them, that is, other Jews or enemies of the Nazi regime, that every murderer and criminal must expect: death sentences and executions. The Jews must be killed. They must be exterminated root and branch. And such words were taken to underscore his violent intentions. Accordingly, Stryker was found guilty of incitement to genocide, which occurs when someone directly and publicly encourages others to commit atrocity. And like the crime of conspiracy, incitement, I should stress, is an inchoate offense, meaning it's an offense without necessarily bringing about the commission of the intended substantive crime. Hence, evidence of mens rea, or the guilty mind here, is having the intent to incite others, while the actus reus, or guilty act, is giving inciting speech directly and publicly. So incitement is one speech crime, and I want to expand our repertoire by looking also at hate propaganda that instigates violence and persecution by focusing on the Balkan Wars, or as I'll describe them, the Yugoslav Wars. These were wars of independence, insurgencies, and ethnic conflicts that took place in the former Yugoslavia and Southeastern Europe from 1991 to 2001, resulting in the forced displacement of about 2.7 million people, 200,000 casualties, and genocide at Srebrenica in the southeastern part of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Very generally, the former Yugoslavia was a communist state, which was patched together after World War II and included 6 republics, starting in the north: Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia, including the autonomous regions of Vojvodina and Kosovo, Montenegro, and Macedonia. And though ethnic and religious differences were restrained by Josip Broz Tito, the lifelong president and dictator who ruled from 1944 to 1980, the ethno-religious character of the republics was and remains historically strong. Specifically, Croatia is largely Croatian Catholic, Bosnia and Herzegovina is Muslim, Bosniak majority, and Serbia and Montenegro have a preponderance of Serbian Orthodoxy. Also in Kosovo, there's a strong Kosovar Muslim majority. And I'm glossing over a lot here, but from Tito's death in 1980 to the onset of war in 1991, ethnic nationalists congealed in Serbia under the regime of Slobodan Milosevic, who seized de facto control of the Yugoslav government after leading an anti-bureaucratic revolution, which was really a series of revolutions and street protests, forced elections, and storming of political centers from 1988 to 1990. This prompted opposing nationalist movements and elections of ethnic nationalists in Croatia under Franjo Tuđman and Albanian nationalists in Kosovo. And things came to a head in 1991 when Slovenia declared independence, prompting a 10-day war between Slovenian defense units and the Yugoslav National Army, controlled by the Milosevic regime in Serbia. But this was eclipsed by the Croatian War, which lasted from 1991 to 1995, in which Serb-led Yugoslav forces invaded Croatia to protect Serb populations, resulting in ethnic conflicts that included city sieges, such as the siege of Vukovar, and ethnic cleansings, the largest of which was Operation Storm in 1995, in which Croatian forces displaced 250,000 Serbs, expelling them to Serbia. Still, the worst fighting was in the Bosnian War from 1992 to 1995, where Serbs Serb-led forces and equally Croatian-led forces attempted to expand their territories into a greater Serbia or greater Croatia, respectively. The results were massive ethnic cleansings, city sieges such as the Sarajevo siege, atrocity crimes, including numerous concentration camps, and atrocities of Bosniaks, the worst of which occurred at Srebrenica, but also in Predor, Visegrad, and Gorazda, in the heart of Bosnia. These were followed by ethnic insurgencies in Kosovo from 1995 to 1998, followed by the Kosovo War from 1998 to 1999, and insurgencies in the Preševo Valley of southern Serbia from 1999 to 2001. The wars ended with NATO bombing campaigns across Serbia, which are controversial in themselves, and an internal uprising against Milosevic, who was turned over to the ICTY, or the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, in 2001. Regarding propaganda, the ICTY showed that the Serb coalition centered on an ideology of territorial expansion and ethno-religious elimination under a neo-ethnic ultra-nationalist regime, which spearheaded propagandistic claims that Serb forces under Milosevic in Serbia, Croatia, and Kosovo, as well as Radovan Karadzic in Bosnia, that they were protecting Serbs. As you can see from this map, Serb forces fought in territories in 5 republics, where Serb ultranationalist leaders propagated the big lie that Serbs were in danger of being wiped out by non-Serbs, and that the only way to secure Serb survival and existence was to have Serb territories free from Croatian and Muslim threats. For Serb forces, one of the strongest ideological threads was rooted in the Chetnik tradition. The Chetniks were and remained a guerrilla force in Serbia that took root in the Hajduk, or banditry, subcultures during the Serbian uprising against Ottoman rule or Turkish occupation in the 19th century, but gained further distinction during the World Wars when they first fought against the Austro-Hungarians and then the Croatian Nazi regime, known as the Ustasha. Overall, Chetniks are a right-wing Serb ethnic nationalist Christian Orthodox movement dedicated to using force to reestablish a strong, if not pure, Serb Orthodox state. And the movement grew in force again in the 1980s and 90s, when it was led by its Hajduk and chief propagandist for Serbia, Vojislav Šešelj, who is still alive and now active again in Serbia, after serving time at the ICTY for crimes against humanity, and remains a fervent ethnic nationalist. And he's infamous for many things, including brandishing his gun in parliament at political opponents, or today, leading nationalist rallies, often burning the flags of non-Serbs. In the 1990s, when the Milosevic regime took over state-controlled Yugoslav media, Šešelj often commented on the stream of misinformation and alleged threats to Serbs. And like Stryker, Šešelj made monsters of others, here non-Serbs. Specifically, he routinely portrayed all Croatians as Ustasha, that is, as Croatian Nazis who during World War II killed thousands of Serbs at concentration camps such as Jasenovac, and also portraying Bosniaks as Turks, and thus as foreign occupiers who subjugated Serbs. And worse, he often labeled Bosniaks balijas, which is a very denigrating word in Serbo-Croatian, which means scum. In speech after speech, these ethnic groups were depicted as perennial enemies that were filth, feces, and waste that needed to be removed from Serbian territories. Thus, as I found during my own fieldwork throughout the Balkans, where I've interviewed close to 150 survivors and former combatants and conversed with twice that many, surveyed about 1,000, Serb-controlled media under Milosevic is remembered as a primary cause of wartime violence, insofar as it imposed a state form of ethno-religious nationalism and hate propaganda that supported radicalized security politics, and the effects of which are still remembered. As several former combatants told me, suddenly you weren't, say, Serb unless you had the right name, the right religion, and supported the nationalists. And from survivors, I heard similar observations, as one Bosniak explained, when people began openly calling us Turks, it was then that I felt threatened. This was because propagandists, and notably Šešelj, made monsters of targeted groups. Šešelj constantly talked about Croatians and Bosniaks as outsiders, enemies, and monsters alongside a stream of misinformation, which supported his and others' calls for revenge. And by the way, I have also conducted several cross-cultural experiments on the effects of various kinds of propaganda, which speak to the power of revenge that I can maybe address in the Q&A. But to illustrate the information, a news story, for instance, quoted by Serb wartime leaders, which would justify the siege of Sarajevo, was that Bosniaks in Sarajevo kept the animals alive by feeding them Serb children. Or another story about this boy whose entire family was reportedly massacred by Bosniaks. But this photo was of a 19th century painting, and like many of the news reports, its associated story was entirely fabricated. Likewise, the Milosevic regime controlled the news, showing footage each night to Serb audiences of the war front, including of victims. All claimed to be Serb victims, when in fact many were victims of Serb forces. Drawing from such information, Šešelj, whether in the news or in speeches on the war fronts, portrayed Croatians and Bosniaks as existential threats and repeatedly called for their removal from Serb territories. For instance, ICTY noted that when citing the so-called threat of Croatians and Muslims, Šešelj would say things that sounded eerily similar to Stryker, such as, "We will defend Serbian lands as long as we breathe, against the poisonous snake, that's the Croats." This isn't the first time that poisonous snake has headed for us, but for the last time it has bitten us to the heart. Now we need to smash its head so it never bites again. The Serbian revenge will come very soon. The Serbian revenge is already starting. Or, regarding Bosniaks, Chetniks, show the Balias, the Turks, and the Muslims the direction to the east. That's where they belong. That is where their place is. And in fact, wherever Šešelj gave such speeches, ethnic violence and persecution ensued. For example, in the town of Hrtkovci in northern Serbia, Šešelj gave an infamous speech to an audience of Chetnik followers and Serb townspeople, where he declared the following: "The Ustasha government in Croatia has again put the knife under the throat of the Serbian people. We say to them, we shall take revenge for each Serb life, and we shall ask them to pay for past crimes, also for crimes in recent history. Nothing will remain unfinished. Serb brothers and sisters, there is no room for Croats in Hrtkovci. We must drive them out to the border of our Serbian territory, and they can walk from there if they don't leave on their own accord." After this particular speech, the crowd made a telling reply, showing their uptake, shouting "Osveta" over and over again. Osveta in Serbian means revenge. And within hours to days of his speech, every Croatian fled Hrtkovci or was forced to turn over property and were expelled. It was this speech and subsequent expulsions that led to Šešelj's charges of instigation and persecution, which I want to consider briefly. Instigation occurs where a group of persons acting within a common purpose to commit a crime, and the individual propagandist in question makes a significant contribution to that crime, such that the contribution was intentional and made either with an aim of furthering the criminal activity or in the knowledge of the intention of the group to commit the crime. This varies only in degree with the specific act of persecution, which was outlined at the ICTR, or the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, where the trial chambers against hate propagandists of the Hutu power movement defined persecution as speech instigating violence against a population on the basis of ethnicity or any other discriminatory ground, which violates the right to security of the members of the targeted group and therefore constitutes actual discrimination. And on this precedent, Šešelj was found guilty of persecution for his speech at Hrtkovci because his words set in motion violent discrimination and ethnic cleansing. Having explored these cases, I should add, no expression is understandable outside the context and speaker-audience relationship, which together constitute the situational factors that make a speaker's intentions clear and link the speaker's intent to subsequent violence. Scholars have largely agreed on the following conditions, which make expressions dangerous and which many hate propagandists have outlined themselves as keys to their success. First, the speaker matters. The more power or authority wielded by the speaker, the greater the danger. Second, if an audience is in a controlled marketplace of ideas or echo chamber, and they themselves communicate that they see the targeted outgroup as an existential threat or signal support for violence, then the situation is very dangerous. Third, if there's a history of conflict or persecution between the groups in question, and the propagandist audience believes violence is justified or warranted as revenge, if not that the justice system has failed, or that there is competition for scarce resources, especially over sacred land disputes, then violence after hate propaganda is highly probable. Taken together, these conditions can tell us about the dangers of expressions within a propaganda campaign. So what can we do? There are many ways to answer this question, but I'm going to focus, I think, on what we as individuals can do to protect ourselves from hate propaganda. First, be on guard against monster making of others. Equally, resist radicalized security politics. Be skeptical when people in positions of authority try to convince us of justifications for collective violence. And have the courage to stand up for your and others' rights. Finally, one of the best things we can do in our time of partisan politics and tribalism is to accept the co-creation of the future with all of our neighbors. Hate propaganda is at its core a project in destroying civility, cooperation, and thus democracy, based on the lie that a group of people are too dangerous for their inclusion in society building. The lie that democracy is too fragile to deal with some people. and the lie that the propagandist coalition is the only political solution strong enough to defeat the purported monsters who want to destroy us. These claims set up dangerous speech. In sum, a good self-defense, I think, is a steadfast commitment to democracy and our shared humanity. Thank you.
Wow, thank you both so much for offering that incredible background and insight. We have several questions here in the chat, so I will be reading them out to you both. But everyone who is attending, please feel free to continue to submit your questions as they come in. So, Jordan, you addressed this a little bit at the end of your presentation. So, Dr. Wiesen, I want to give you an opportunity to respond as well. But we have several questions here asking how ordinary citizens can combat this type of hateful rhetoric when they see it appear in the public discourse.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that Jordan really touched on some key points at the end there. That's the one of the things that I always hear people who are overwhelmed by the challenge of this suggest, which I find very useful, is what he said, namely to speak up, to say something, rather than simply sort of let the hate speech wash over you and say, I can't do anything about it. Make even a modest statement that this is not right. This actually has a tradition. You may not realize it, but you're tapping into a stereotype. Obviously, we have mass movements built around a certain amount of hate speech in the United States, in all over Europe today. So that feels like an overwhelming challenge. But I think, again, if you go to the old sort of think locally sort of adage, it's important to note it, to speak up about it, and to learn. So I think that there are ways in which maybe people who unconsciously mimic these sort of stereotypes and tropes, not the kind of monsters that we focus on in some cases, but the sort of everyday person, they may not know always what they're saying. And they are surprisingly open to just a sort of gentle reminder that this has led to horrors in the past.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think of Hannah Arendt. She has a comment in one of her books about, when people stood up to the Nazis in places, they melted away about like butter. And I think that kind of the kind of acquiescing to these things, as Dr. Wiesen pointed out, is not the solution. I think it is saying something about them. I think it is being on guard against these things and not buying into certain narratives and depictions. And that doesn't have to be done. I think, I would add to that, just based on my own experience in the classroom, where I think I've seen things that are effective and non-effective. I think being in a way of inviting the persons in and not calling out is a really important thing for us in our own circles and spaces in which we are today, is to try to draw people in, as opposed to pushing them towards a category in the that they may feel threatened by being pushed into.
Thank you so much for that. The next question we have here is in regards to the ongoing debate around the definition of anti-Semitism, which I'm sure we've all seen here in the US and also other spaces. How would you say the mislabeling of anti-Semitic on someone's words or actions can damage the term's efficacy and our ability to combat it when we need it?
Yes, what a timely term. What a timely question. It's a huge discussion within, not just within the Jewish community, but in the community of scholars of anti-Semitism, because it's a very powerful claim, obviously. To call somebody or somebody's ideas or speech anti-Semitic is rightfully a powerful thing to do, because you're calling out somebody whose language conformed and led to genocide. However, it's important that we don't, in effect, sort of overreach, and that's hard because we have different definitions. Like, people wandering around the Columbia campus, they will feel targets of anti-Semitism. Others will not. So, it's very timely. And I think the key, though, is to make clear distinctions based on intent, based on what people are specifically saying. In other words, you may have somebody calling for a particular action today on a campus against action in the Middle East, that they may not be anti-Semitic if they are saying something that conforms with an old stereotype. But this is the moment of education. Now, I mean, there's ways we can talk for hours about whether sort of how Zionism and critiques of Zionism fit into anti-Semitism. And I will say, to directly answer your question, there is always a risk obviously, of when you sort of label or mislabel or exaggerate label people as anti-Semitic who are not, you do risk sort of watering down intensely real cases that are on the rise now. But the problem is, how do you define it? There are people going back and forth to this very day. What are the limits of definitions? Sadly, there's a lot of it. A lot of it fits into it, but not everything does. And we have to keep having these conversations.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. The only thing I would add to that, there's a book out right now. It's called The Borders of Hate Speech by Brown and Sinclair, and they deal with a lot of these borderline issues. And one of them is responsive or reprisal hate speech, where someone could be in response and it can be an edge of a rightful, a justified righteous response. That's correct, or it could be one that's almost borders on hate speech as well. And I don't have the answer to that, but they explore it in this book, and it's one that legal scholars are talking about. For instance, calling someone a racist when in fact they're not a racist can be pretty damaging to someone, and they can take offense to that. Not to say it's hate speech, but they explore these border categories, and I think this is one that might be. It's a timely book. It just came out, and it's probably relevant, I think, to this question.
Thank you. That's really fascinating. We have a follow-up question here to our earlier discussion, asking, what do quote on guard and speak out mean more specifically? I'm thinking of social media reposts maybe not being enough. So if either of you have sort of more concrete examples of how these interventions, these calling ins can be conducted.
I'll let you start, Jordan, if you want.
Yeah, okay. And research-wise, I can say that something that's being investigated right now, I talked about Susan Benish at the beginning of my talk. She's working on the Dangerous Speech Project, and others like them are investigating the effects of counter speech and what kind of counter speech work, what kind of counter speech doesn't work. And so I think it's an open question for us, and it's not one that I think that that only the audience has. I think that scholars are wondering ourselves. And how much is counter speech effective? So I think I'd probably leave it at that for the research wise. For myself, dealing with these issues, I often find that the more that you can make a conversation one that draws on seeking understanding, and trying to get out of spaces where you have a call out culture like online. I think a lot of that is simply about signaling. It's not so much about even having a conversation. And if you're in those spaces where it's about signaling and moral grandstanding, I don't think you're going to have effective counter speech. And instead, the more that you can communicate with individuals as individuals or groups as groups with their perspectives that should be understood, the more effective that will be. And that's going to be very hard. That's very costly. It's very time consuming. But I think if you can look at parts of your life where you have a few persons that you can have these conversations with and do it in an understanding way, it can have a large impact outside of the broad, world-changing endeavors we might have when we're on social media and we're kind of engaged in collectivism.
Maybe we can, yeah, I think that speaks well to, it's not easy, for sure. I mean, I won't build on that too much, except simply to say that social media is possibly the most difficult nut to crack here, because people, they think they're being righteous in posting their belief or critiquing or reposting someone else's ideas that they find powerful, but without the face-to-face conversation, with this anonymity, people both hurl slings and arrows more easily, but they also can't defend themselves. So you get this sort of emotional investment in not being called X, Y, and Z, but you also sort of perpetrate this faceless, anonymous approach to discussing ideas. So I think, just to build on that, I mean, there are these sort of important discussions people have, they have to have, if not in rooms like this where we're virtual, actually face to face.
So we have time for, I believe, one more question here. So this one relates very strongly to Dr. Kiper's work, and it's about this co-opting of security culture or security dialogue. As your research shows and as the historical record shows, many acts of collective violence, atrocity, also occur within a murkier context of war, armed conflict, military struggles, territorial struggles. Um, what are your thoughts on how public and national dialogues around security and safety, um, and what has to be done to guard those discourses against inciting speech, hate speech, dangerous speech, that sort of thing?
Yeah, Dr. Wiesen, do you want to, Jonathan, do you want to answer that one first? I think with your insights about history, you'll have.
Or I didn't quite follow it. Say it again, Hannah. Just really.
Absolutely. So the question is, how can we observe, defend, quote unquote, security culture or security speech from devolving into a space of inciting speech, dangerous speech, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I do know the how do you keep it from devolving? It's so hard. I mean, there's a general rule of thumb in my area that the longer a social media discussion goes on, or the longer any discussion over something passionate continues, the more likely you are to have somebody brand another person a Nazi. It's actually, there's a playful mathematical formula that attends to that. The closer to 100% you get to seeing the word Nazi. I mean, the question of devolving of speech, it's really hard to say. I can't even answer it. I'm struck by it constantly. Again, it's sort of building on what I said earlier. It's really difficult to kind of break through the passions that are available in these new sort of electronic and online spaces. I think the only thing you can do is, again, sort of on a local level, build alliances and coalitions where you feel passionate. And I know this sounds almost like, pie in the sky, kumbaya, but I think that the more you get away, the more you feel sort of tormented by speech that you can't control and that you can't get a grip on, the more I think you need to kind of move into areas around your community where you can make a difference, whether it's applying the lessons of the Holocaust to another injustice you might see, to getting involved in, even just voting rights, where you feel like in some historical instance, Jews, for example, or others were denied the vote. So, I don't have an easy answer, Hannah. You kind of got the $64,000 question, as we used to call it. Now there's inflation.
Yeah, I think to add to that, I would draw on the Yugoslav situation that I think is frighteningly similar to what's happening, I think, close to home nowadays and in many places around the world with rising authoritarianism. And I would say that there needs to be more nuance and a place for the middle in terms of politics. That as things start to escalate on one side gets more extreme, as in the case of Serb nationalism, another side becomes equally as extreme. So there's this ratcheting effect, and with it a kind of tribalism and commitment to one's side without even granting concessions to the other. And as that ratcheting effects happens, I think the nuances are removed that drive the security claims towards radicalized security, and ideological hardliners become the ones who really occupy the rhetoric and the zone of decision making. And I think I don't have the answer of how we turn that down, besides having nuance. I think, for instance, so much of that's happening right now politically. If how do you find, where are the persons in the middle who can recognize the claims of both sides, and being ostracized? I think probably persons in the audience and those of us who are a part of this conversation understand that we are probably more of the nuanced folks who try to recognize, and how often you get blowback because of that, or even an exclusion that no one really wants to hear that. And how to change that, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, let me just build on that by saying there is, by some people's own assumption, there's a kind of a silent majority of people who see complexity, but there's no room for that in public discourse. You can feel bad for multiple sides. You can want to promote policies that uplift one side or the other. But as you say, in this polarized environment, Jordan, it's very hard to stake out a claim that sort of, and a politics even, that speaks to kind of a middle ground. And that's really the challenge, again, with the kind of ability to move ideas and propaganda across, the universe in a millisecond through email and social media. You don't you have to be flashy and splashy and take a claim that doesn't allow for complexity. And so, what we're seeing that even played out on the campuses, to speak to this last question, as people misunderstand each other, talk past each other, and perceive the other as questioning their very existence. But that's not to say that we don't have policies and politicians that are real threats and that loom. And so I think finding where you have common ground against a real kind of potential authoritarian solution takes a lot of work.
Thank you so much for both of your brilliant presentations, your observations and expertise in this conversation. Unfortunately, we are at time, so I'm going to wrap us up. But first of all, another huge thank you to you both. I want to let our audience know that our next Taking Action Together program will be held on May 15th. We're very excited about it. It will be held in association with the American Friends of the Parent Circle. It'll be a very unique program. We'll be hearing from two bereaved fathers, one Israeli and one Palestinian, as they recount parallel stories of grief and a journey towards peace activism. So we'll be continuing this conversation around the other, violence, reconciliation, and what nuance and middle ground can be offered. So if you're interested, please RSVP on our website today. All of our attendees will also be receiving a follow-up email to today's presentation, which will include a link to the recording that you can share with your friends, your family, anyone who you think might be interested or wasn't able to attend today. We get our best traction by word of mouth, so we strongly encourage you to share. And once again, if this program was valuable to you, any donations will help us continue to produce this great content. So we look forward to seeing you on May 15th. Thank you, Dr. Kiper and Dr. Wiesen. Thank you all for being with us here today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.